The retirement industry wants you to believe that you're never ready, that you'll run out of money, or that you'll be a burden or regret leaving work. But what if they're wrong? In today's video, I'm going to show you how $750,000, when planned and used the right way, can fund a satisfying and secure retirement without a second career or needing to win the lottery. I've run hundreds of retirement projections over the years, and what I've found is that $750,000 is actually more powerful than most people realize when structured correctly. And that's exactly why I'm making this video today, to show you how a $750,000 nest egg can provide a lasting retirement, and what specific strategies make this possible, and how to determine if you're ready to leave the workforce for good with this amount. So let's get right into the video. And I think a good place to start is just to ask a simple question. What kind of income can you actually expect from a $750,000 portfolio in retirement? You know, a couple years ago, Dave Ramsey caught a lot of flack for saying that retirees could spend something like 8 or 9% of their portfolio per year during retirement. And I know it's always fun to disagree with Dave Ramsey, but in this instance, I actually think he's got a good point. And, you know, I think 9% might be a bit high, but I actually kind of see where he's coming from. And let me explain my thoughts here. If you don't have any legacy goals, then spending a lot more than the typical 4% that you hear, I think is completely realistic. And just think about it in terms of if you went out and bought an immediate annuity. Generally speaking, if you're in your 60s, that immediate annuity is going to pay you somewhere between 7 and 8% of the total value every year until you die. And you can think about your retirement the same way. If you were completely fine in spending down your portfolio over the rest of your lifetime, well, in that case, then a higher withdrawal rate than 4% makes complete sense. And you could technically structure your portfolio for this and not have to pay an annuity company those fees. And so it's completely realistic to have a much higher withdrawal rate than, say, the 4% that you hear all the time. And so in the client example that I'm going to use for today's video, in this case, the client can spend from their portfolio, like withdraw from it, $45,000 to $50,000 per year, which ends up being about 6.7%, and they still have a median ending value of more than $200,000 at the end if you run a Monte Carlo analysis. And if you just do kind of straight line modeling, I mean, they still have about $400,000 left over after a 30-year retirement out to age 95, and that includes 2 years of really high spending at the end for long-term care. And look, I know that all the time you see on YouTube or in the financial media safe withdrawal rates that hover somewhere around that 4% value. They might be a little higher, and sometimes actually they're even lower than that. But there are two problems with this. First of all, most of the research that indicated that that's a safe withdrawal rate, a lot of that happened in the early 1990s, and that was, at this point, it's kind of based on outdated research. The second thing I would note, and plenty of critics point this out, is nearly all of those types of safe withdrawal studies, they're showing you the absolute worst case scenario. So if the worst case happened in the financial markets, that would be the safe withdrawal that would enable you to never run out of money. And look, I think it's great to prepare for the worst. The reality is, in almost every situation, nobody is ever going to experience the absolute worst case in financial markets. And if that's your concern, there are definitely ways that you can structure your portfolio so that you make it through kind of the worst case scenario. And so, you know, when you do something like that, what you find is you can actually take a much higher withdrawal rate than what's indicated by some of the more extreme studies that have been done on this. And we'll go over some of those ways that you can actually, you know, protect your portfolio from the worst of it without giving up a ton of upside and losing out to inflation. So I think another question that's important to ask is, why do financial advisors often overstate how much you need to retire? And I think there are a few reasons that this happens, and not all of them are cynical, but some of them definitely are. And so first of all, let's just start with the calculators, right? Many of the tools that you're going to find online assume that you're going to spend the same or even more in retirement than you did while you were working. And That's actually rarely true. Most people see their spending drop, especially once they stop commuting, paying payroll taxes, supporting kids, and so on. And even housing costs go down too, especially like if your mortgage is paid off and so on. But a lot of the free online calculators don't actually factor that in. And instead, they'll use a flat assumption to inflate your income needs. And so the point of it is they're pretty inaccurate. And most retirees, they have a very different spending pattern than just straight line, everything going up with general inflation every year. Now, if we switch to the more cynical side of the argument, I mean, listen, let's be honest here, guys, right? There's a total structural incentive behind this. If you are being told that you need $3 million to retire comfortably, you're probably going to save more, you're going to invest more, and maybe you'll even stay in the workforce longer. And that's going to benefit the financial institutions, whether that's through more advisory fees, product sales, or just keeping more money under management for longer. And then if we move over to looking at financial advisors specifically, what you find is that in some cases, and even well-meaning financial advisors, they're going to rely on default settings in planning software. And those are simply built in to be overly conservative with their assumptions. So a few examples here might be, they would project spending at a constant inflation-adjusted rate until death, even though we know that this isn't the most realistic pattern of spending for retirees. They might ignore Social Security claiming strategies that could reduce the burden on your portfolio. And another thing I found is that they'll assume that you'll never adjust your spending, even if markets perform poorly. And once again, that's just simply not reality. And what ends up happening is that many retirement plans end up being more about avoiding every possible bad outcome instead of building a plan that matches how people actually live. And I get it, like it's always nice to plan for contingency, but you don't have to be that extreme in your planning. And I think it's honestly been to the detriment of a lot of retirees. And so the point here is you don't have to take on more risk or spend recklessly. It's that the advice you're getting might be based on assumptions that don't apply to your situation. And they might be leading you to over-prepare in ways that delay retirement unnecessarily. So now that you understand the common mistakes and overstatements in traditional planning, let's look at what actually does work. We're going to look at some strategies that can help make $750,000 last a lifetime. And so what I would say is the first step is rethinking the idea of a fixed withdrawal rate. Ultimately, it's pretty suboptimal to take out the same amount of money each year, plus inflation, regardless of what's happening in the market. It's not how most retirees actually live, and it's definitely not the most effective strategy. And when I mentioned research at the beginning, I think there's plenty of more recent research in the last, let's say, 15 years or so that indicate far and away the best withdrawal strategies are going to be the dynamic spending ones. One of the better known frameworks is something called the Guyton-Klinger framework that uses guardrails to help you stay on track. And here, what you would do if markets are going well, you'll increase your withdrawals. If they're not, you're going to make temporary cuts, not drastic, but it can make a huge difference over time in actually making sure that your portfolio does last. And when you look at studies like these, what you'll see is that you could have a much higher average withdrawal rate over the lifetime of your portfolio, over 30, 35 years, still go through those terrible periods, then you could just using a strict, I'm going to take 4% plus inflation every single year, no matter what. So the money is going to last longer and allow you to actually consume more, which most people find desirable. I think the second important piece, especially of a portfolio that is this size, is having some type of guaranteed income, right? This could be Social Security, might be a pension. It could even be an annuity, something like a single premium immediate annuity, none of the fixed index annuity or variable. Look, I don't have an insurance license and I'm biased. I hate those products. I'm literally just dealing with this now. Somebody had a variable annuity and they're paying like almost 4% all in when you cover all the fees. It's insane. And there's like different riders and benefits. But my point here is, Immediate annuities can provide a guarantee, and what you would do then is you got a smaller portfolio. You might say, okay, I'm going to take $250,000, annuitize that, know that I can consume a lot. It might pay you 7 or 8% on that. And look, when you die, it's gone. But then you can take the rest of your portfolio and invest that for growth. And if the annuity is covering most of your basic needs, then you don't have to worry so much about drawing from the other part of your portfolio that's meant for growth. And you're going to be able to sleep well at night, and you'll probably end up in a much better position over the long term than simply just being overly conservative in your investment strategy. Because the thing about it is that, this kind of approach is going to give you like a pension-like income floor. And then you're going to know, okay, if worse comes to worse, I have to come up with, 10 grand or something from my portfolio. And even if markets aren't doing well, if I'm only taking 10 or 15 grand, you're going to be okay and probably be able to recover from it. So now that you understand these sustainability strategies, fill out the questionnaire in the description, and I'll send you a video analyzing your specific situation and showing you exactly how to make your retirement savings last a lifetime. But now back to the video. Let's talk about what life actually looks like on $750,000 month to month. And the short answer, as with everything, is it depends on how you structure it. But for many retirees, a portfolio of this size can support a lifestyle that covers essential needs and leaves room for some wants, especially if you're intentional about where and how you spend. So if we look at research that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as of their most recent data, it says that households headed by somebody 65 or older spend about $52,000 per year on average. But that number varies a lot depending on where you live and whether you have a mortgage. Obviously, if you're in Manhattan, you pretty much spend $50,000 walking out the door, right? So obviously very different than living in the South or the Midwest or something like that. Now, in the client example I mentioned earlier, they're spending between $85,000 and $90,000 a year, and that was sustainable for them even after planning for long-term care needs later in life. And so if we move on to the next point about how to make this money last, one thing that I think far more people would be better off considering is having geographic flexibility. I totally get how difficult it is to just uproot yourself away from your family and friends and where you've lived for a long time. But the reality is, if you happen to live on one of the coasts and you don't have multiple millions of dollars, being flexible and willing to move is going to be one of the best things that you could possibly do for your situation to make sure that you don't actually run out of assets. And if you do that, you can actually budget to just go back and visit sometimes, and you'll still be far better off than staying in one of these really, really expensive cities that are on the coast. And in some cases, I mean, you might not even have to move that far. Sometimes it just simply might mean moving a couple of hours outside of that metro area that you were in instead of, halfway across the country or something. So here's a few areas that you might want to consider. So I always read the travel vlogs, and I always get articles about, great place for retirees. And so I thought I'd put this up here. Here's a few areas you may want to consider. You've got Western North Carolina. You've got some beautiful scenery around there, and it's a lot cheaper than, some of the major cities. One, I think, interesting option from a city standpoint is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is incredibly, incredibly cheap. And if you like living in a city, it's going to have most of the amenities that you care about in city life. I mean, yeah, it's not New York. You're not going to have the MoMA and those things, but for most people, it's probably adequate. Another area that comes up all the time is the Midwest. You've got Michigan. Illinois is an interesting one. So Chicago always gets a bad rap for being expensive and so on. And I'm not suggesting you move to Chicago, although if you're coming from New York, you'll save a ton of money. But just the state of Illinois in general, what's interesting about it is it doesn't tax Social Security, pensions, or distributions from IRAs or 401ks. And it is a flat tax state. I think it's like 4.75% if I recall off the top of my head. So that's not super high. And so the reality is, as a retiree, you could find a place maybe somewhere outside of Chicago, and it might be a lot more affordable for you than a lot of other areas of the country. And then there's always moving abroad. I get it, not for everyone. This is definitely our plan because we like this kind of stuff. But yeah, Portugal is a big one. Mexico, Spain could be wonderful. But a lot of retirees even like Panama and places like Costa Rica. So there's a ton of interesting places that you could look to online. Southeast Asia is another one. I mean, Thailand and other places are incredibly affordable, especially compared to American standards. And so if you want your money to go farther and last longer, it's something you should definitely consider. So look, understanding how to adapt to economic challenges is also crucial for making that $750,000 last through your retirement. So now let's turn our attention to how can we protect retirement from inflation and market volatility? Because even if you have a solid plan, one of the biggest threats to a portfolio of that size is unexpected inflation or market downturns and things like rising healthcare costs. And so let's start with inflation. Inflation is a thing that kind of slowly creeps up on you over time. And so over a 20 or 30 year retirement, even a modest inflation rate can cut your purchasing power in half, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. And so right now, if you're spending $60,000 a year today, you might need closer to $90,000 20 years from now just to buy the same goods and services, just assuming a 2% annual inflation. And so that's why if you're trying to live on a fixed income alone without any type of growth exposure, that can be really risky. Just as risky, in fact, as investing all of your money in stocks and going through a depression. And so your portfolio needs to include assets that have the potential to outpace inflation over time. Some of this protection is going to come from smart social security strategies. And so you want to spend a lot of time figuring out how to maximize the cumulative lifetime income of yours, and if you have a spouse, your spouse's social security. One of the, I think, most effective inflation hedges is delaying your social security as long as you can, unless there are good reasons not to, and then living off your portfolio income in earlier years, doing things like Roth conversions and so on, and then making sure you lock in the highest social security in case you do live a really long time, because that's going to be something that goes up with inflation every year as opposed to a pension or something like that. And so for many retirees, this ends up being the most valuable inflation protected income stream that they're going to have. On the investment side, not all assets respond the same way to inflationary periods. Stocks tend to perform very poorly during periods of high inflation that is continuing to trend up. So the threshold when they do studies about this is generally 4% or more, and stocks actually do very bad in that environment. Over time, they beat inflation, but there might be decades or more where they do bad. And then, as you probably know, bonds really, really struggle bad. They have that fixed coupon, and so you're just not going to be able to keep up. One important study here I'm going to pull up, it's called The Best Strategies for Inflationary Times, and they go back hundreds of years and looking at England, Japan, and the US, who have like the most complete data on really high inflationary periods and then how their financial markets reacted. And what they show in their research is that, commodities, especially energy related, do really, really well. But the caveat here is those kind of assets do very poorly outside of high inflationary periods. So it's not necessarily the best type of asset to have in your portfolio all the time. But what's interesting is they have trend following strategies that invest in commodities that use momentum, and they'll bet both for or against a trend in commodities. And those tend to do well both in inflationary periods, they do really well, and in other periods. So that's something that you can add to your portfolio that I think is really going to help you protect it from inflation over time. But if you don't have a high inflationary period, it still should do, pretty well also. Then you have things like gold and precious metals. And man, do I hate talking about it. I think there's some really interesting aspects of gold, and please don't go out and buy it right now based on me saying this. If you're interested in owning gold, hit me up. There's some really good research on the things that you should evaluate. And we're at an all-time high right now, and so I don't want anybody taking this as blanket advice, but it's a very interesting asset to hold in your portfolio. It does do very well in inflationary times and in times of uncertainty, but you've got a lot of kooks out there, guys, and to them, gold is always the answer no matter what. And these guys tend to be charlatans, and they have a big incentive. They're selling you something, right? I want you to be very wary of that, but no, it's a nice diversifier, and that does do well during inflationary periods. Other things to consider for your portfolio, I circled down there. You've got TIPS. Those are Treasury inflation-protected securities. So here, it's a government bond, but it actually increases with inflation. And so you're going to be able to keep up with your purchasing power. And of course, down at the bottom, I circled in red, some of the things that do really poorly. And that's, government bonds or even regular corporate bonds. And you can see the red streak over there in their negative returns after accounting for inflation. Now, the other big one as far as risks go to your portfolio, something called sequence of return risk. And that's when you retire and you're drawing from your portfolio and you have a really big downturn and you have to tap into the principal of your portfolio and markets don't recover and you risk running out of money early. Something I like to recommend is what you call a bucket strategy. So that's where you have safe and stable assets. So you might have assets that I can get to immediately that won't hardly move at all, and you might have a year of those. And then you might have intermediate term assets that move a little bit, and that might give you another 2 to 3 years of withdrawals that you could access that's safe and not going to move around, and the rest of your portfolio can have time to recover. Not all markets will recover within 3 years, however, and so there are other risk management methods to use. I hate buffer ETFs, any kind of structured notes. Also, if you want research on how terrible those things are, hit me up. I'm happy to send it your way. But I think there are some good risk management methods. I do something called tail risk hedging. And, that's sort of like buying crash insurance on your portfolio. And it allows you to invest more in stocks over time and kind of offset the cost of the insurance. And what I found, that tends to be a really effective way. And it doesn't cut off the upside like some of these other stupid investment products do. But look, guys, ultimately the goal isn't to avoid all risk, which you can't do. It's to build a retirement plan that can be flexible and adapt. I'd say a plan that can handle the inevitable shocks without falling apart. And now that you've seen how these strategies can help make $750,000 last through your retirement, let's look at how you can use this information to optimize your retirement plan. So the first question to ask is, how do you know if this is enough for you? As I indicated, if you're in Manhattan and that's all you've got, you might actually struggle. So the first thing is, it starts with understanding the numbers, not rules of thumb or averages. You need to understand your lifestyle, your income sources, and your goals, and that's going to help drive the math. And a good place to begin with this is just your current spending. Most people drastically underestimate how helpful it is simply to know what they spend in a typical year. And if you're already living on $80,000 a year and you receive $45,000 in Social Security, that's going to give you a clear gap to solve for, around $35,000. And, that's not just some abstract retirement target. From there, you're going to need to build in safety margins. But again, not so much that you over prepare and delay retirement unnecessarily. You just want to be cautious without being extreme. So now let me go through a list of some specific steps that can make $750,000 retirement work. So number one, structure your investments intentionally. And this goes back to what we just talked about with the investments. And, in addition to what we talked about, it means you want to have a mix of income producing assets and long-term growth holdings, not just picking the balanced fund in your 401k. Number two, use dynamic withdrawal strategies. That's like the guardrail approach that we talked about. That's going to let you adjust your spending based on how markets are performing. Number three, create multiple income streams. So that would be, you're going to have Social Security, that might be annuities, maybe that's rental income, or it's even income from your portfolio. Number four, build a floor under your income. And this is kind of going back to the bucket strategy that I mentioned. So, it might be a portion of it could be guaranteed income, or it's just having that bucket that is safe, that you can keep for a few years, that might be in cash or other low risk investments, with the goal of not having to sell investments in a downturn. 5, plan for healthcare and long-term care early. Even a rough plan is better than ignoring it. So there's a couple of things you could do. If you have time, definitely, if it's available to you and you're not, you don't have any chronic illnesses or anything, you're not a big healthcare consumer, start an HSA and let that thing grow and don't spend it down until you start retiring. And that can kind of be set aside healthcare fund. Something else you may want to consider for long-term care, they have some what I think are, pretty good and interesting hybrid like insurance and long-term care policies these days, where it kind of works like you'll get the cash value of the premiums you paid back no matter what, but you can also use it for long-term care purposes. And I think they're way better than the old policies, and generally they tend to be less expensive. So that's something you may want to consider as well. And finally, number 6, focus on satisfaction, not just spending. Research continues to show that retirement happiness has more to do with your time use and relationships and health than it does with how much you spend. And I guess if I were to add one thing to the list, it's look, keep your plan flexible. Having the ability to adapt, whether that means cutting back during a rough market year or relocating to a place with lower expenses, that often matters more than just hitting some perfect target. Okay, so now that you understand the true potential of a $750,000 retirement portfolio, hopefully you can make a more informed decision about whether this amount is sufficient for you to never work again. And if you'd like a personalized assessment of your retirement readiness, complete the questionnaire in the description below, and I'll send you a detailed video showing exactly where you stand and what specific steps will help you achieve a work-free retirement with your current savings. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.